everyone. I'd like to introduce our first speaker for this afternoon's session, Dr. Thomas Prowse from the University of Adelaide. Thomas is a quantitative ecologist with a particular focus on population biology and epidemiology for wildlife populations. More specifically, Thomas uses stochastic modelling to address applied ecological questions in the fields of wildlife management, fisheries, conservation biology, invasion ecology and disease ecology. Welcome, Thomas.
Thank you for that, and it's a great pleasure to be here. I'd like to first acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands that we're meeting on and their elders past, present and emerging. And a big thank you to the Nurrinjeri Aboriginal Corporation who took the time to meet with us a number of times over the course of the project and were very supportive of our research, and we greatly appreciated that. So this component of the project was all about research to inform how we might make good decisions to maintain viable waterbird populations, both in the Coorong and throughout the broader network of wetlands in the region. The Coorong provides important foraging and breeding habitat for non-migratory species, but it's also important for migratory shorebirds, many of which are suffering global population declines. Because there are a lot of waterbirds, we initially focused on 10 key waterbird species. These included 6 shorebirds chosen to represent, or 6 shorebirds because we have concern for that group as a whole. 4 of those are migratory, so the redneck stint, 2 sandpipers and the common greenshank, and then 2 non-migratory or resident shorebirds, the red-capped plover and red-necked avocet. We looked at 2 herbivorous waterfowl, black swan and chestnut teal, and then 2 piscivorous or fish-eating species, the Australian pelican and the fairy tern, which is now listed federally as vulnerable. One of the best data sources we have on these waterbird species is the annual census, which is conducted in the Coorong every January. And that provides information on species level counts, as well as whether observed birds were foraging or not. On the right here, we just have some example time series showing the total count of different species in the North and South lagoons. South is red, North is blue. If I just pick out a couple, you should be able to see that these are all pretty different depending on the species, but if I pick out a couple, sorry, I've hit the wrong button. The common greenshank up here, typically numbers in the hundreds in the North Lagoon, but only in the tens in the South Lagoon. Below that, the fairy tern, you can see here in the Millennium Drought, that species essentially dropping out in the South Lagoon as it shifted its foraging and breeding behaviour to the North Lagoon. So we can take these data on site level occupancy and abundance and use them to formulate models to describe how waterbirds respond to different physical and biological characteristics that were present in the system at the time. So these are things like salinity, water level, the area of habitat within a certain depth range, the density of ripea shoots, and the abundance of macroinvertebrate or vertebrate prey, depending on the species. And I just want to talk quickly about some really obvious results that come out of this historical data. The first is that high salinity negatively impacts the fish-eating or piscivorous waterbirds. So, for example, here for pelicans, pelican occupancy, meaning the probability of seeing a pelican at a survey location, pelican occupancy declines as salinity increases, and that's true in both lagoons. Okay, so that's probably reflective of the fact that high salinity impacts the fish that pelicans are targeting. And if we get these really extreme salinities in the South Lagoon, then the probability of seeing a pelican is really low. In a similar vein, we GPS tracked 16 pelicans during the course of the project over a period of 2 years. And here we've classified these GPS locations according to whether we think the animal was in transit, meaning it was flying quickly here on the left, or likely to be foraging. And the key message here is that even for individuals that we think were breeding at North Pelican Island in the South Lagoon, that's this arrow here, even for those individuals, they're primarily travelling to forage up in the North Lagoon. So the I guess the overarching message here is that, essentially that pelican foraging in the South Lagoon is obviously just not productive enough, and probably high salinity affecting fish populations is one of the drivers of that. Results were similar for the fairy tern in that if salinity gets above about 100 parts per thousand, occupancy starts to drop off. And on the right here, we can see this red line. This is showing that the probability of observing a foraging fairy tern is increasing with the density of small fish. There's been times in the South Lagoon where small fish density has been incredibly low, and the probability of fairy terns foraging there is also incredibly low. The response of the waterfowl was a bit more species dependent. So black swan occupancy in the North Lagoon, those blue lines, is pretty stable, pretty invariant to conditions. But in the South Lagoon, occupancy of swans drops off as water level increases and as salinity increases. So that's probably reflective of the fact that the aquatic vegetation that swans are after is more accessible when water levels are lower, and also probably healthier when salinities are lower. For the chestnut teal, this species is a bit more salinity tolerant and probably has a slightly more generalist diet. Occupancy is pretty invariant to water level and only really starts to drop off for salinities greater than 150 parts per thousand. So a bit more salinity tolerance there. Just some results for some example shorebirds. So this is the curlew sandpiper and the redneck stint. So as we might expect for birds that forage in shallow water or mudflat, occupancy in the South Lagoon for these species declines as water level increases for both species here. There's some indication of optima at intermediate salinities. So supporting these results for water level, we conducted a field study over one season where we looked at a number of sites spanning the North and South Lagoons. We quantified the number of each shorebird species, and we actually estimated the amount of shallow foraging habitat there at the site at the time. So foraging habitat here we're defining as wet mudflat or water with a depth of less than 5 centimetres. So these are just some results for two of the most common species, red-necked stint and red-capped plover. You can see on the left here that the abundance of both of these species is increasing as the average foraging habitat area at the site increases. But also importantly, the abundance of these species goes up or down as the habitat area at a site changes. Okay, so this is due to things like the seasonal changes in water level, but also the wind pushing the water around. So I think the message here really is that these shorebirds will use shallow wading habitat if it's there, and as long as they're in the Coorong in the first place, as long as the water quality isn't so bad that there's nothing living in it. Okay, so that relationship between shallow wading habitat and shorebird abundance is really strong, but how much of that habitat is available throughout the broader southeast region? As part of the project, we went out and surveyed 31 wetlands in South Australia. So we didn't bother surveying completely dry wetlands. So these are 31 wetlands that we found with water in them. So this figure just shows the proportion of occupied wetlands for each species that we observed, with the migratory shorebirds highlighted in red. So for these 5 species, none of them was observed at more than 2 of the wetlands. And this is data just for one season, the 2021-22 season. But from doing these surveys, the really clear thing is that at these wetlands, there just isn't, or at most of the wetlands, there isn't a lot of shallow foraging habitat available. So the Coorong is only part of the picture for these water birds. They're obviously going to be, or their occupancy in the Coorong is obviously going to be affected by conditions across Australia. So now with remote sensing, we can actually estimate surface water availability across Australia. This is an example year here for 2011, which was a really wet year. And then we can look at how the occupancy in the Coorong or elsewhere is affected by those Australia-wide conditions. And that's what's happening in these next two figures. So here a negative estimate means birds are less likely to be observed if Australia is wetter. And the Coorong, there are two species where that is really clear. It's the red-necked avocet and the sharp-tailed sandpiper. So put the other way, these species seem to be using the Coorong as a bit of a drought refuge. We looked at citizen science data for the southeastern Murraylands as well, and we found that relationship for quite a few shorebird species. Again, it was really strong for the red-necked avocet and the sharp-tailed sandpiper. That's those asterisks there. So in line with those results, we did GPS tracking studies on those two species and documented movements north into inland Australia. So for the sharp-tailed sandpiper, we caught this species just using these little shorebird traps positioned along the shoreline. The birds, as they happily foraging, will occasionally wander into those and then have trouble getting out. We use really lightweight tracking units, just weighing 1.4 grams, and fashion harnesses out of lightweight fishing line to try and keep the weight down as much as possible for these guys. We just documented 2 long-distance movements away from the Coorong. These both happened in March 2021. One individual left the Coorong and then spent a bit of time at Todrell Game Reserve on Lake Alexandrina before heading up to wetlands to the east of Lake Eyre. The second actually flew non-stop from the Coorong to just close to Tennant Creek in the Northern Territory. That was about 1,900 kilometres that trip and took about 38 hours. Unfortunately, those trackers then failed and we're not sure if they continued their migration or whether potentially they overwintered in Australia. As far as we know, no one's GPS tracked red-necked avocet in the wild before. These guys are really hard to catch. We tried a few different methods and ended up using a method where we essentially stalk them around the shallow edges of the Coorong at night and trap them with a hand net. So this is pretty labour intensive. We managed to GPS tag 10, but after sort of extensive rains in inland Australia, all 10 of these individuals left the Coorong in early 2022. So you can see these GPS tracks here, and these dots are showing wetlands that were visited, known wetlands, and the blue wetlands are ones that were visited by more than one avocet. So this big blue patch here is a wetland near Berry, which multiple avocets visited on their way north. A couple of avocets showed some central place foraging movements around Lake Frome, which is to the east of northern Flinders, so they may have attempted to breed there. And 2 of these individuals have since come back to the Coorong, but then left again. So obviously there's some level of site fidelity to the Coorong, but they're not just sticking to it. So in contrast to those 2 species, the Australian pelican, as I mentioned, we know that breeds on North Pelican Island, so we can try and look at the behaviour of breeding birds. These results here on the left panel are for the 2021-22 season, where we think that 8 of 16 tagged birds were breeding on the island. As I mentioned earlier, they're travelling north primarily to forage in the North Lagoon, but you can see they're not travelling in a straight line. Often they're heading over the land, and that's probably to access thermals, which can help them get up quickly for minimum effort. Results are quite different for the 2022-23 breeding season. Out of 13 working trackers we had left, we think 11 of those birds were breeding on North Pelican Island. We still saw movement towards the Northern Lagoon and the lakes. We're now looking at the blue lines for 2022-23, but also extensive movements to the Riverland around Berry and Renmark. So this is for birds we're pretty sure were breeding on North Pelican Island due to their continual return to that site. So the longest foraging trip we documented was 275 kilometres, and that trip covered at least 1,000 kilometres over 4 days. The longest duration away from the breeding colony was 9 days. Obviously, these animals are working in pairs to allow that to happen. So again, I guess the key message here is that even when pelicans are tending, we think, quite young chicks, they're not foraging in the South Lagoon where they're breeding, they're actually electing to travel much further and search for more productive foraging grounds. Just for interest, these are the movements of 3 birds after the project officially ended in June 2022. One travelled to close to Renmark for 3 months and then returned to North Pelican Island to breed, we think. One got across into New South Wales and returned. And then a final bird here in white has travelled to Lake Brewster in New South Wales, where there's a really large pelican breeding colony. It's showing evidence of central place foraging, so we think it's probably attempting to breed there. And interestingly, I haven't shown these results, but that pelican actually just soon after we tagged it travelled all the way up to the Gulf of Carpentaria and then came back to the Coorong in the space of a couple of months. So this might be an individual that has a bit better knowledge of a broader area than some of the others. Thank you. Okay, so over the last few slides, we've seen some evidence that obviously it's not just conditions in the Coorong that are important for these waterbirds, they're also responding to regional factors. We know from the historical data and also from our GPS tracking that the shorebirds at least are tending to occupy quite well-defined regions of the Coorong where there's an abundance of shallow wading habitat. The question then, if regional factors are important, is, should we really be using just abundance as an indicator of habitat quality? Just going to see if this plays. So this here is a foraging redneck stint in the South Lagoon. Foraging away, it seems pretty happy, right? But how could we really tell? So we're interested in trying to think about habitat quality from the bird's point of view and spent some time on that. So essentially we went out to a number of sites and documented behaviour of the birds, and particularly looking at peck rates and step rates. And then at the same time we quantified a number of environmental and biological variables, and importantly this included shallow sediment cores, so that we could estimate the density of macroinvertebrate prey items on the day that we had observed the birds doing those behaviours. So results for peck rate were all over the place, really didn't show much, but we want to suggest that step rates is maybe a better indicator of what the birds, how the birds are feeling about their food availability. So this is some results for the redneck stint. Stint step rate decreases as the average prey density at a site increases, and also responds to variation in prey density at the site. Okay, so step rate is lower when prey density at that site is higher than it has been on average. So maybe this is one way you could use a behavioural proxy to estimate what habitat quality was like. Finally, we're interested in documenting the body condition, particularly of migratory shorebirds, as an indicator of how they're going. We might expect a priori that when shorebirds, migratory shorebirds arrive in around about October, they'll be skinny, and then if conditions in the Coorong are good, they should fatten up over the season before migrating again in March or April. So we documented a lot of individuals just with still photos. We scored them as being skinny, a 1, up to being fat, a 5, and really couldn't find any evidence of body condition change in the Coorong over a season. It's just one season, so it's hard to draw conclusions from that, but no evidence really that they were fattening up. We were interested to know if this could be automated, this process, to see if it could be used as more of a long-term monitoring tool of body condition. So we developed essentially a machine learning pipeline to try and classify these images automatically. So essentially what this does, it takes a still image of a shorebird, classifies it as suitable or unsuitable for body condition scoring, so that's to screen out birds that are in the wrong pose and images where there's something in the way of the target individuals. We then extract features from that image, including the outline of the bird, and then train a neural network, which is just like a black box thing that you can use to take the features and output a predicted body condition class. Okay, and then we validated that for 4 species using images that were unseen, so essentially images that hadn't been used in the training process. Currently, we're achieving 83% accuracy at predicting the body condition score within 1 unit of an expert score, so it's not going too badly, but we're actually trying to develop that and improve that at the moment. So just a wrap-up slide. Waterbird functional groups are responding differently to Coorong conditions, and obviously following on from that, that means that a single management strategy is not going to be optimal for all species. One thing that's really clear is that extreme salinity in the South Lagoon, like we saw during the Millennium Drought, getting above 150 parts per thousand is detrimental to a lot of species. Clearly too, shorebirds need shallow wading habitat. Their abundance and occupancy responds really strongly to that. But throughout the southeast, there isn't a lot of that habitat available. So those on-the-grounds works projects like at Lake Horden, Tollerol, Taringi, to me do seem quite important that you can manage those and create that wading habitat at times of year when it's not being produced in the Coorong, such as times during this year when we've had the big flood. Finally, we did look at habitat quality proxies. We suggest that step rate could be a decent indicator of food availability if you don't want to go out and measure food, prey items all the time. And automated body condition monitoring is something we're pursuing and trying to refine that over the coming period. I think I'm at time, so I'll just quickly acknowledge these groups and people, and thanks for listening.